Hello and welcome to the Barrie Art Museum. My name is Charlotte Potter Kasic and I am the executive director here. We're excited for you to join us and celebrate the exhibition that we're opening today. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about this museum. Some of you maybe have never been here before and we hope you can come join us in person. Our museum was founded by Carolyn and Dick Barrie. We opened our doors in 2018. We sit right at the edge, at the crux, or the gemstone, the jewel in the crown of ODU. You can come right to us on campus. We opened our doors with three major collections: glass, painting, and historic automata, and dolls. The paintings range greatly. We have everything from American modernists to marine paintings and everything in between. Our glass collection focuses primarily on studio glass, but also some incredible contemporary pieces like the ones that you're seeing on the screen today by Monier Farmanian. And of course, we have historic dolls and automata, which is what we plan to talk to you all about today. We even had a really interesting exhibit that just closed, Motion Emotion, that unpacked automata as the precursor to modern day robots. Coming up, we have Perspectives. Join us March 10th as we open a brand new exhibit that debuts a brand new collection of glass that's just come to us from the Waitzer family. 165 objects will be shown. And today we're here to celebrate the great exhibition, Bebes at the Barrie. This is a show that's going to unpack one part of our collection. In fact, our founder, Carolyn Barrie's maybe favorite part of our collection, which is primarily French Bebe dolls. We do have lots of programming here at the Barrie Art Museum, and we're about to launch into Black History Month. We have 3 really incredible programs coming up, so tune back in again to see some more. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the guest curator who we have worked with to develop this exhibition and many more. She also worked with us on the Motion Emotion exhibit that I mentioned earlier. Her name is Sara Woodbury, and Sara is doing her PhD right now at William and Mary. She also has worked at a number of other institutions and is really fascinated with a bunch of different topics. We've asked her to really fine-tune her research and think a lot about dolls for this show. And I'm excited to introduce Sara Woodbury. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's virtual preview of the great exhibition and Bebes at the Barrie. So this show is a showcase of a collection that's near and dear to Carolyn Barrie's heart, the Bebes. And there were a variety of ways that we could interpret the show. Now, we'll be going through the objects one by one in just a minute, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background information on the exhibition itself and its major theme. So we decided to interpret the Bebes as an international phenomenon, because if you think about it, Bebes have had a profound influence on the doll industry and dolls as we imagine them as objects and as material culture and more. So in thinking about this show, we decided to delve a little bit more deeply into how they functioned in the international sphere. And what better way to do that than through the world's fairs that took place during the 19th and early 20th centuries? Because these Bebes, these French dolls, appeared on a global stage, and that was how their influence was able to extend so far and wide, not only through the world's fairs themselves, but through advertising, marketing, and other types of objects. In a lot of ways, Bebes foreshadowed the type of immersive material culture that we will see with Barbie and other dolls during the 20th century. All right, so we've got some fantastic dolls to look at, but before we delve into that, we just want to clarify how the Q&A works. So I will bring back Charlotte for just a moment.
Thanks so much, Sara. So this is a conversation. This whole discussion today is going to be between 3 of us. We have one more specialist we'll introduce in a moment, but there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see it. It's green, it's low. And if you click on that, you will be able to ask questions. At the end of our presentation, after we've gone through the whole exhibit, you guys will have opportunities to ask questions, and we hope that you will. So use it actively, and we hope to get to all of your questions at the end. Thanks. Is this a good time to introduce Florence, you think? Okay, so we're really excited to be able to introduce our final speaker here today, Florence Theriault. Florence has come down from Annapolis. We're so happy to have you. Thank you.
The rain yesterday. It's a beautiful museum. It's absolutely wonderful. You've done a fabulous job. Kudos to Carolyn for all she's done for the doll world.
It's true. Carolyn really, it was her vision to reposition dolls, I think, as art objects. And that's very much what we do here today. Absolutely. So Florence kind of needs no introduction, but for the few of you who might not know who she is one of the foremost, I would say, academics in the field of dolls. She does she does tons of research. She's written books. She's done extensive research and also has a wonderful auction house who we often work with when we are able to get some of the rarest dolls in the world. So thank you and welcome.
I'm happy to be here. This will be a lot of fun today. We've decided we're going to do an interactive communication, walking through and talking about things.
Yeah, definitely. So with that, why don't we head right into the gallery and let's take a look at the real stars of the show here.
Did you want to start outside here?
Actually, yeah, why don't we start? This is one of Carolyn's favorite pieces, very near and dear to her heart. So why don't we take a look at this piece? Florence, what do you have to say about it?
Well, this doll was offered by the very, very extraordinary doll firm of Andre Toulier. And his dolls were made perhaps for about a 10 to 15 year period of time, originally made with a kid body, which is interesting in this whole story of the bébés, because the bébés evolved from the fashion dolls known as poupées, and almost invariably they had kid bodies. And when the bébé first appeared, it was made with a kid body by people like Leon Casimir Bru and Andre Toulier. So his first dolls were made with kid, and then he evolved into making what we're going to talk more about, the composition wooden jointed body that could be really articulated. So he's considered one of the prime early French doll makers.
So what are the advantages of, say, composition or wood over a kid body? Why would the bébé makers want to transition to this different material?
I think several reasons. One would be durability, because when the fashion dolls were being made, they weren't played with in a childlike sense. They were played with more, even by a child, almost as an exhibition. Costumes could be changed, although not at first. Originally, they were tacked onto the doll. But eventually, they were designed for the child to try different costumes back and forth. But kid can wear. It can tear, it can wear, it can rip. When the wooden, so that would be one reason. With the wooden, you don't have that. You have durability. And another one that's even more, articulation. That's it. All of a sudden you have a doll that is becoming like a real child. You can move it, you can pose it, it can sit, it can kneel, it can lie down, you can raise the arms, you can have it doing the things that a child could play with a doll, and imagine they're playing with another little child.
Yeah, I love that detail about how the material tells you about the function of the doll and its use. And you're right, now that I think of it, in terms of the articulated, it'd be a lot easier to pose a doll that's made out of a harder material like composition or wood as opposed to kid leather. So, but yeah, this doll is absolutely beautiful, isn't she?
She's absolutely wonderful. And again, she would have, this is now then, so he began making dolls with a kid body, but he went to this articulated composition in wood eventually. And a lot of people don't realize it, because when we look at dolls today, the first thing we tend to look at is their face. We're all excited about if it's beautiful, if we love it. But if you go back to the patents that were done in France at the time, the great majority of the patents concerned the body. That's what and so even when I say loosely use the term kid body or composition or wooden body, there's so many variations. We once had a large collection come into us of a person who had a doll hospital. So they had literally thousands of doll bodies. And I thought, oh, this will be fun. We'll get them all arranged and we'll see what goes with what. There's so many variations. And that, so that was important. They were all trying to find what would be the most durable, what would offer the most flexibility. For example, you might have in some rare occasions a swivel waist, as opposed to just a one-piece torso. You might have legs that could have a swivel action on the upper thigh as opposed to just a jointed knee. So these were all different variations.
That's absolutely fascinating. And we'll see that conversation continue into the 20th century with, that quest for a durable, perfect, unbreakable material. And when I think of vinyl and hard plastics and whatnot, that we'll start seeing in the post-war era after the 1940s.
Exactly. And, so much of, again, I always try to bring the history of the doll or the presentation of the doll into a wider social context. Well, it's horrible to think that out of a Great War comes plastic, but that's what happened, and that's how it evolved the entire doll industry in the late 1940s and moving into the 50s, was the plastic that had been developed during wartime.
Yeah, and that's something that I find fascinating about the Bebes too, is how they're very much engaging their time in terms of the technologies available, the fashions and whatnot. They're not existing in this separate sphere that children play with, and they don't engage the larger world. I mean, on the contrary, they're very much involved with the larger world, not least through the great exhibitions.
Exactly, and that's kind of what this entire exhibition is about. And we tend to think of the great exhibitions as presentations of almost like museums, but they weren't museums. This was all about business. This is what it was all about. And it was a way. We have the internet today. You don't even need an exhibition. You can introduce your new products all the time and tell about them. But then how was anyone to show the world what they were making, what they could offer? They had the great exhibitions, and even to get accepted to have your work shown there, there was a lot of maneuvering to do behind the scenes to say, okay, my doll is going to be shown there. So some of the people like Emile Gimot, really, they won the prize because they had so much marketing ability that they always were accepted in the fairs. And other smaller firms, and I'm not sure about Touye, I would have to double check, but I think Touye may be one of them. A lot of them would join in almost like a cooperative, so that there would be one exhibition space, and they would all get together and say, let's us try to compete for this exhibition space.
Oh, again, fantastic. Just emphasizing the interactions between the Bebe makers. Well, as gorgeous as this doll is, I know we have lots of other examples to look at. So why don't we head inside the space?
I still that's what you say. Go for it. So I had a couple like really basic questions. As a maker myself, I always think of these objects as little sculptures, multimedia sculptures, because they have glass, which of course I'm fascinated with, the hand-blown glass eyes, the porcelain, the kid, which you guys keep referencing. For those of you out there that maybe are not familiar with dolls, kid is a leather, right? Yep. Wood. And when we start to look at these things, I really think of them as little sculptures. And I wonder, could you clarify, because this is something I always had a question when coming in from a non-doll collector, were these really played with or were they really sculptures?
Well, that's an interesting question.
It's a tough one.
A little bit of both. Actually, some of them were sculpted by famous sculptors of the time, and we'll look at one in a minute. I'll show you who it is. So in that sense, they were originally made as a sculpture, but they were, what we're going to look at today, were not made to be a sculpture in someone's home. They were made to be a plaything.
An interactive.
In some instances, they were made to be a model for fashions of the times too. Certainly we know earlier that was the case, but even into the Bebe period, they were wearing the costume that was the costume of that season. And Emile Gimot was really famous for this. His wife, Ernestine, was the head of the costuming division of his company, and she traveled all over the world looking for silks and the proper materials and the right fashions. And twice a year, just like a clothing place might have their fashion show, she would have her doll fashion show, and she would introduce the new styles that children were wearing at that time. Very, very fancy clothes, but still.
And I think, don't we have a whole label that talks about that over here? Yeah,
we do. One of the things that really interested me researching these Bebes was how they were made, and more specifically, who made them, and particularly the labor of women, from the bisque pouring and the pressing process to especially the costuming and the clothing and the fashion sense of Ernestine Gimot and her contemporaries. these dolls are remarkable for the clothing that they have. It's admittedly very humbling to look at them and know that they're far better dressed than I'll ever be.
Is this the moment for the big reveal? Because I know a lot of people are waiting.
I think they are. So
Okay.
why don't we go ahead and take a look at them? So these are a pair of dolls that just arrived in Carolyn Berry's personal collection. They were just installed today. We are very excited to have them here. And Florence, I think you know quite a bit about these dolls. So do you mind telling us a little about them?
All right, well, these actually, because the dolls have, I gave this little lecture a little bit earlier today that I always give about none of us own the dolls at all. We're only just keepers of them. They'll pass through our hands and they pass through other hands, and our job is to preserve them. And it's been my privilege to handle these dolls twice so far. We sold them about 20 years ago, and they went into a private collection home, and we sold that collection a few weeks ago. And I was so thrilled when Carolyn called and said, "Do you think these are good dolls for the museum?" And I said, "Carolyn, they belong in your museum. You must have these dolls," because they are dressed as exhibition models, and they would have appeared in when we don't actually have a documentation and a proof that like their ribbon from that award, we can't be sure that they actually did. But in all likelihood, they appeared in one of the exhibitions of Emile Gimot at the end of the 19th century, either in, well, probably the 1900 exhibition. He did a series of postcards at that time, and in which he showed on my far side is a boy with a smiling face, and that is from one of their rare 200 character series that he first introduced, ironically, because you have automatons here in the museum. He was asked by the automaton makers to create dolls that weren't just pretty girls, but that had character expressions. And that was a series he did. And then, always being the marketing guy and looking for a new angle himself in business, he just said, "Well, wait a minute, I don't have to just be automaton heads. I could make bébés out of them." So he did. And he would introduce them, and they're extremely rare. It was never a thriving market because people wanted the pretty dolls. But here is one set that likely was created for one of the grand exhibitions, and they are wearing their extraordinary original costumes of a carnival type affair. Wonderful. This is really remarkable to still retain that black silk banner on his sleeve. That's an original banner that was put there by Emile Gimot that says Bébé Gimot, and it's so delicate to have it be retained is absolutely wonderful. They have their original shoes. And one of the things Gimot did, I'm sorry, am I talking too much?
Oh, no.
Okay. One of the things that Gimot did, again, I said, this man, in terms of the exhibitions, he was all about marketing. And so when he won his first award in 1878 at the Paris Internationale Exposition, excuse my French accent, but he won that. And thereafter, back rump of the doll is the sign Gimot Médaille d'Or, gold medal. And that was, he really pushed that in all of his advertising, and all bottoms of his shoes will have the reference to the Médaille d'Or. He was, unlike many of the other companies that would have a head poured by a porcelain firm, get their body from someone else, their costume from someone else. He did everything himself in his factory. He and his wife, who doesn't get enough credit, and we've got to push her, Ernestine, because she really promoted them. The eyes of his dolls were eventually made in his own factory, which was pretty remarkable. Not to be, when you talked about the glass, you're interested in the glass, and people don't pay enough attention to these. Every one of these dolls is a little miniature paperweight. They're works of art. So at any rate, I've rambled on enough about them. They were extraordinary, and to find them so intact and so perfect after all of these years is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, that was what struck me about them, because before Carolyn acquired them, she was asking the staff how we felt about them. And as soon as I saw them, it's like, He's one of the character dolls. Yes, we have to have him. He could be a great counterpart to our automaton out in the other side of the gallery. I think we should, just to show the range of emotional expressions, because this series is fascinating.
I didn't
Yes.
notice this until we were setting it up this morning, but they're both wearing their original gloves. And
That-
you have to realize
that
how
is
they fit.
remarkable.
They fit so tight on those hands.
Oh
that if
my
you never
gosh.
took them off, you'd never get them off. And they're matching. that
They
light
are.
aqua color.
I was going to say, I think this is the first time I've seen gloves on the which, I mean, as a fashion accessory, that would absolutely be expected for the late 19th century. But yeah, let's take a look at this automaton, because what really struck me about this series was just the range of emotional expressions.
So this piece, I feel like elicits a lot of different responses from the public. People, you know, the uncanny valley certainly gets called up. I think people often are wondering, why is she crying? And we have a video. If you come to the museum, you can see it. It plays, that shows exactly how this works, but she's upset. She's angry because her puppet has just been broken. And I really just, again, as a glass blower, the single glass tear coming down the face, that detail just kills me. I think it's just a really wonderful detail. But to see the range of emotion that he was attempting to capture here with his different pieces is just really fascinating.
Well, and that was why I was drawn to this piece in particular. Not that I revel in crying children. I don't want to give that impression, but you know, for me as a scholar researching these dolls and other objects, what fascinates me is, you know, the market for them. Who would be interested in owning this particular object? And with a lot of the bébés and their serene, placid faces, I can understand that in terms of, sure, they're beautiful. But I'm really interested that Jumeau and Lambert and his other collaborators thought there was a market for this in terms of niche, but it needs to be addressed. And enough of these survived that we know there was a market for it. And that to me is absolutely fascinating, that there were people out there who saw this and said, yes, I need this.
They were never, I don't have any documentation on this, but based on how many we find in their original costumes, perfectly preserved like this is, I don't think they were really children's playthings that much.
Yeah,
I think they were mostly, they would go into the salon and and the family would have I don't know if we had cocktail parties and whatever you had, and they would show
Line
these
them
and
up
show the
and- yeah.
pieces. And it would be more almost like an adult entertainment with the children observing, but
Right.
not the children ever really playing themselves.
And I really appreciate you specifying that, because so often dolls and automata are grouped together in terms of they're the same object and they're often made by the same makers or they know each other and whatnot, but they really do serve different functions, especially with the automata as these really refined art objects that happen to be kinetic.
And I just want to point this out to you because you love Ernestine Jumeau. So Leopold Lambert, all right, he commissioned the head from Jumeau, but Leopold Lambert made the automaton. And who made the costume?
His wife did.
Yes, there we go. Once again, the success of the piece based on
Yes.
the wonderful, I mean, extraordinary costuming that his wife was responsible for.
Yeah, and again, it just emphasizes, you know, not only the gendered nature of the labor in terms of women doing the costuming, but it also emphasizes that these are family businesses, aren't they? In terms of, you know, it's not just the patriarch who's involved, but it's his wife, it's his children, their grandchildren. These are very much family affairs.
Exactly.
All right, so we'll head back into the, thank you, audience, for indulging that quick diversion.
It felt like we had to.
We had
I think it
to.
should be about the first.
Oh, yes. So, you know, we can continue with Jumeau, or should we talk about Brew?
Well, let's move over here.
Because I know when it comes to talking about bébé makers and doll makers and whatnot, you can't leave out Brew. And we have several different examples here encompassing the different models, because he had about 3 primary types, didn't he?
Well, we did, and we talked earlier, went on about the kid bodies, and one of the reasons you asked me, why did they back away from kid bodies? One of the things that happened with the kid bodies is they were always concerned, because they were artists in their mind, is they introduced, Brew would have introduced the bébé, but then he said, well, all right, I only know how to make these kid bodies. That's what I've ever made. So he would assume he would put the kid body on his baby. Well, he had to be concerned with changing the scale because a child's body would not be as tall and as thin. So all of his baby bodies were proportioned correctly. One of the things that he ran into, and it affects people's appreciation of these dolls today, which is too bad, is that the dolls he couldn't seem to get them, the earlier models, he couldn't seem to get them standing straight. And they always have what is kind of indecorously referred to as the early crouch position. Because they're sort of like bent over like this. But that's just, I mean, that it comes with the territory. And it actually is a mark of their being one of the early ones. He had special bisque hands made for them when he used his kid body. So it wasn't like just a kid hand. He had these beautiful bisque hands made. And this example is really rare because of her complexion, her brown complexion. And this was another factor of the great exhibitions, because people were traveling now to France from all over the world, and wealthy people. And he wanted to appeal to them. So this was the era during the late 1870s into the 1880s, 1890s, when a lot of the black dolls came out and were particularly designed to appeal to that internationally traveling market.
And I'm really glad you brought that up, because that also coincides so well with what's happening in the culture at large in France at the time. You do have a lot of Black Americans, for example, migrating over to France to escape Jim Crow laws and whatnot. And you start seeing a lot of Black popular culture introduced in Paris. So, like the minstrel shows, for example, but also the cakewalk and other forms of music and whatnot. So these dolls, again, are engaging this much larger popular culture and are reflecting and embodying and furthering what we're seeing among artists, musicians, and whatnot. So, yeah.
At the beginning, though, at the great exhibitions, it was more geared toward a very wealthy aristocratic class. The later period came in like the early 1900s, 1910s, but this time period would have been geared to wealthy travelers from Africa, the Middle East, that type of thing.
Okay, so that's like some of our automatons then that are, you've
Exactly.
gone on this great trip. What better way to commemorate your travels than with this object that is basically a souvenir of this trip you've taken?
And sometimes they were dressed in classic fashion of the time, Western fashion of the time, and other times they would be dressed in very elaborate costumes of their own region.
Yeah, because again, I really liked the analogy that you made earlier, talking about the world's fairs as the internet of its era. What other place can you see all of these different countries and world cultures represented? They're also very much products of their time, aren't they, in terms of colonialism and the infrastructure that was set up that enabled these kinds of goods to go back and forth between these different regions, as you have trains and ships and whatnot.
We tend to think of the exhibitions also, we tend to think of them as being in Paris, but remember, it was London, it was America, it was Australia, it was all over the world. And that's how these dolls became introduced in these places. And they were all the great exhibitions where you had to apply to get in, to be accepted, and then you would buy to win the medal, the gold medal.
And that's, again, one of the things that really fascinates me about these dolls is that, we imagine them as very French, very Parisian, but they're really on a world stage at this point, not only through the fairs happening in Paris, but also, as you said, in London, Chicago, Australia, and whatnot. They are all over the place. And especially through the marketing tactics of Jumeau, they're ubiquitous in the visual culture too.
Jumeau, as a result of this, would have had his dolls would have been carried in many of the prestige stores in France, but biggest market, America. It was always the biggest market. And not only to Americans traveling to France, of which sometimes it's still an absolutely remarkable that we can find a doll today that's still in the original family that had kept it all those years, and they purchased it when they made the family grand tour, which was so big in the 1890s. And other times they were sold in prestige stores in America.
So seeing so many of these dolls in American collections really isn't all that surprising then, is it? It's a continuation of what we saw in the 19th century in terms of their markets and their major audiences being Americans.
Yes.
Why were Americans so interested in these dolls?
Oh, I think America has always suffered from thinking that Europe is the cultural center of the world and we're just the guys eating hot dogs on Coney Island or something. And we've always, that kind of snobbery has always been hoisted on us and we've always fell for it. So I think that was a great part of it. In the meantime, we were busy building our own country over here and eventually things kind of turned around and flipped upside down in that regard.
It's kind of like how we're all fascinated with like British accents, for example, in terms of, oh man, if only I sounded that refined.
And when the Academy Awards come out, you always want to have foreign films because they must be so much more artistic than we are.
Oh,
So you think it's
goodness.
worth at this moment talking about the World's Fair with some of the other material dolls that you pointed out?
Yeah, let's go
Yeah,
pop
I
over
think it's a
there.
nice transition. So this is not technically within this show, but it is part of our larger gallery. And it's an area that was developed with Susie Peterson, who's our head of education, as well as Sara Woodbury as we did this reinstallation. And it's really trying to unpack materiality in dolls, transcending time and really just thinking about what was used at this time. And Florence was pointing out just a few of these dolls that were really important to the Great Expositions.
When I first saw this lineup today, I thought this is really exciting because, well, I love all of the dolls in here, but I want to point out a couple of them that I think are really significant. And this shows not only the evolution of the doll, but the kind of the universality of the dolls. We have here a Japanese doll. Granted, he's a little bit later, but he's an example of what I want to talk about. In the mid-1800s, Japanese trade, that had always been a very closed society, and Japanese trade came and decided to introduce some of their items at these international fairs in London and Paris. And they introduced their Japanese, call him a play doll, because he had a body that could be articulated. And voila, what happened? These French doll makers suddenly said, oh, well, yeah, we never thought about it. Maybe kids would like to actually have a doll they could cradle in their arms and they could articulate, they could move. And hence the Bebe, the whole focus of this exhibition was born out of that knowledge of the Japanese doll. And so then just in between, we can come to an incredible doll by Emile Gimot, one of his primo dolls. And you asked about sculptors before, done by a noted award-winning Parisian sculptor, Carrie Oberleurs, sculpted this head for Emile Gimot under commission, and it's unique in his line. It's a very, very special facial model that he used only for this doll. And then I want to skip forward in time again, because so this would be like, mid-1800s.
Yeah, it says 1848 to 1913.
Okay. Skip over here, and this is an entirely different doll. Remember I said things started to slowly change and Americans started to appreciate their own culture, but usually in small ways. And one of the ways was a doll made by Emma Adams in her small community. And she made a cloth doll with an oil painted face. And in 1873, going with the World Expositions again, exhibitions, she exhibited her doll at the Chicago International Exhibition, which was known then as the Chicago World's Fair, 1893. And guess what? Emile Gimot didn't win the gold medal. She did. First American doll maker and a woman. Go. All right.
Well, and again, what's so fascinating about this doll, especially, is it's talking again to our, the use of materials and how they emphasize broader interests at the times. I know one reason why it's this cloth doll and that's why it's the surface is treated the way it is that Emma Adams was very interested in a hygienic doll, a doll that could not only be played with but also washed, so it could maintain a clean condition for children, because of larger awareness of germ theory, of disease prevention was really becoming more widespread at this time. And you can see that again embodied in the very materials of this doll.
Yeah, this case is fascinating. We go from like, the wood doll to the cloth doll, the paper mache doll, which we know these have been x-rayed to find different interesting things within them. Then we get to the porcelain or bisque, as people call it, porcelain, the gofun, and then finally the composite. So the point of this case is really to start to unpack all the materials that were being used by the artisans of their time. So thank you for once again
letting us digress.
Yeah. We digress. Once again, we'll go back into the exhibit.
Well, I'll say, I know we've talked about Jumeau and Brew, but I don't think we've mentioned the Steiner yet. So why don't we talk about him?
Well, Joel Steiner was a very, very interesting gentleman, and there has been an entire book written about him, which is a very, very wonderfully researched book. And he was a clockmaker by trade, and that was his background. And he somehow moved into dolls, but because he was making little novelty kind of mechanical things at first, and somehow, and I don't know if anyone knows how the actual evolution took place, that he moved into the making of the porcelain dolls. And he would be a good example of the porcelain head being made in one factory, and then he would have made the body because he was very interested in the articulation. One of his first dolls he made was called the Bébé Gigateur. And a body, a very simple body. It was like the torso was a case, a linen wrap, I don't know, oval shaped case. And inside were the mechanical works. And when you wound it at the side, it waved its arms and legs, and it waved and kicked its arms and legs and cried mama. And it was made first. The head would have been made in like a paper mache, and then it was eventually made in this bisque, because to him the mechanics was the interesting part of it. But he did, over a period of time, he got interested in the porcelain. He had special models made for him, I don't know, perhaps about 10 different models that are made, and very, very sought after, and very much of an award-winning doll at the time. And his bodies also will have stamps on them that will tell of the different awards that he won at the great exhibitions. So that's an important thing to look for.
So one thing I'm curious about, now that you mention it with some of Steiner's models, is the mechanization of the bebes that we start seeing at the end of the 19th century. This is a pretty controversial topic among collectors. What are your thoughts on it?
I think, again, we can go into broader history if it's okay. So getting toward the end of the 1800s, and the German doll industry was kind of pretty rapidly taking over the French, which had really been the controlling until that time. And as that happened, the French kept looking different ways that they could capture audience. And I don't know, I mean, this happened. Oh, and the other thing is, they not only had to keep their audience, but the German dolls were a lot cheaper.
Oh,
they had to find a way to make their product less expensive, so they could also keep it going. So they looked for gimmickry, and they looked for price. And those two things impacted in the making of their dolls. I think that people collect different things. Sometimes people like the mechanism. I mean, Jumeau alone came up with so many different walking mechanisms on his dolls. Sometimes the legs just walked up and down. Sometimes they were just hinged, so they would go back and forward. Sometimes there would be kiss throwing action applied to it. In my experience, most collectors, that's not what draws them to a doll. They may not have anything opposed to it, but it's not what draws them to a doll. I don't know. I could be wrong.
No, that's just so interesting because, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, it's very much about how do we modernize these dolls through mechanics and movement and talking and speech and whatnot. But among collectors, it's much more about what's that timeless quality in terms of the aesthetics. Let's strip down the mechanical novelties and go back to the quality materials in terms of the construction and the costuming and the real focus on just the form of the doll itself, as opposed to the accessories of movement.
Exactly. Well, the one thing I have noticed a kind of a growing interest in, though, is in 1892, Edison, I may have the date wrong on him, but Edison came out with his phonograph doll. And Jumeau then came out with his phonograph doll done by Henri Leroux. And there seems to be a growing interest in that. And I think that's because of a growing interest, not among doll collectors per se, but people who collect the transition of creation of music for other people to hear.
Interesting.
I mean, think about that. Prior to that, you had to go hear a guy playing his guitar on the street, or mama playing the piano in the living room, or you had to go to the opera, but you didn't have recorded music, and that was the beginning.
Yeah, that's really transformative, isn't it? I mean, today you can just go on Spotify and listen to whatever you want, but you couldn't do that then. I mean, we do have a Bebe phonograph, so why don't we, for those interested viewers, check it out? So we do have a Bebe phonograph in the collection, and here she is. So this piece is from the 1890s, and in addition to doll herself, we also have some examples of the types of recordings that you would have been able to play on the doll. They were often marketed in different languages to, again, appeal to different audiences, emphasizing the global nature of the Bebe.
I will tell you from my experience, very few of them ever make a sound that you would much want to listen to for more than 5 seconds or so. But it was the beginning. And you have noted here that the speaking doll was introduced by Thomas Edison in the 1899 Paris exposition. And, it's really quickly jumped on this and found a person. Now, what you have is, when you look at it, you have a doll that looks like a classic Bebe, with an open mouth, of course, because who would think that you'd have a doll that could make music if their mouth was closed?
So a really good ventriloquist.
Yes, but it always came in the one size. If the doll was undressed, you would see that the front of her torso was like a cage door that could be opened. And that's where you would put the whatever change of phonograph you wanted to put in there to play the various tunes. And it evolved over, I think, 3 different systems of winding evolved on it. And then the doll would sing these songs. And again, in so many different languages. I had a collector once who spent 25 years of her life I was looking to see if that came from her collection. It was a Huguette Clark collection that we sold. And she had worked with us for many years. And for 25 years, she was on, find me a Russian language recording, because she knew she had some kind of thing that she knew from her childhood that recording existed. We could never find it.
We'll have to look through our canisters.
Yes, exactly. See if you have, you do. And anyway, there is kind of a really good collector interest in these at this point, because I noticed that even if we don't have a doll, if we just have a selection of the recordings at this point, there's a lot of interest in them. So people are looking for them.
Well, so with the reinstallation of this museum, for those of you who have come before, you must come back. There's now been designed in topical sections. So we have dolls and technologies, dolls and fashion, materiality, culture, and art. Well, you brought up Huguette Clark, so I'm wondering if it makes sense to quickly show the prints.
Oh, sure.
I mean, the prints is really I know that did come from that collection. And it definitely is a standout piece in our fashion area, which of course is pink. And the reason why this piece has always been so fascinating to us is that, well, fashion is such an important part of dolls. But this is a very unique Bebe that has a custom costume, I understand. And I thought maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
And we have the letters.
Huguette Clark was the last remaining family member of the famous Clark family who, well, Las Vegas, Clark County is named after her father. Let's put it that way. Her father was one of the first people that came west trying to look for minerals and gold and silver and made a fortune. And that would have been, I think it was in the 1840s. Huguette Clark, this is incredible. Think about these dates. Huguette Clark died in 2000, now I forgot the date. She lived to be 105 years old. She was born when her father was 60. So I'll do the math there, whatever it is. And she was his last remaining daughter, last remaining family member. She collected dolls and she had an extraordinary curiosity about things. But one of the things she loved as well as dolls is she loved good fashion. And she purchased many of her own clothes from the Dior shops in Paris and New York. And because she was such a good customer, she would tell them, I would like you to make a costume for my doll. And here's much of the correspondence she would have back and forth with them, telling about what she wanted to have made, how she wanted to have it made and all. And this is an example of an extraordinary, a wonderful Jumeau doll, beautiful complexion, beautiful brown eyes, and wearing a costume that was made exclusively for him by the Christian Dior shop in New York. So spanning almost 2 centuries, and but with important factors, people and factors in each.
So we have been getting quite a few questions from the crowd. I'm wondering, do we want to address those now or do we want to jump back in?
How are we doing on time?
How are we doing on time? We have 15 minutes. Okay, I'll ask a couple now. So Jessica Bernstein says this is brilliant. And she's asking, how does the French word mannequin, or does the French word mannequin for what we would call fashion model fit in with the word bébé and what it connotes? Does mannequin and bébé have a relationship?
It depends what you mean by mannequin. If she's referring to like the wooden mannequins that would have been used for almost 200 years at that point, both as an artist mannequin that could be articulated. I thought you had one here.
You do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or do you mean a mannequin like a mannequin in a department store? You know, it depends what you mean. So I don't know how to answer that, I guess. I will tell you that the fashion dolls, Rue made a fashion doll with a wooden body that was exactly like that artist mannequin body. Swivel waist, everything about it, more highly refined, beautifully finished,
Sure.
but clearly that was the inspiration for it.
Yes, she's specifying in the 20s. I mean, human wearing clothes called mannequins. So full.
So what was the question again then?
We might have to move on to the next one. Okay, does the museum have an adult Lindsay Salon doll from the early 1900s? I do not think so.
I would love to have one.
You have one that you want to do?
Yeah.
Are there Edison dolls out there with the records? They're asking, are there actual Edison dolls that have the records still?
Yes, but rare. They're rare. They're very rare.
What was the maker again of those? Was Tom, did he do it? Who did the face?
Who did this? Usually it's a Simon and Helbig model face.
I think I heard one being played on a YouTube video once.
Mhm.
I'll be honest, they're very eerie to listen to because, you know, the technology is over a century.
It's
old
very
at this
scratchy
point,
and
so-
yeah, and broken. It is.
Okay, another question is, love the black brew costume. Is it original? I think that's one with the kid legs, right?
I know the one you mean, and I'm inclined to say yes, but I honestly would have to examine it a little more. If it's not original, it's really good.
Yeah.
Great. So those are most of the questions for now. We're going to wander back into the galleries and we can take some more right at the end. So thank you for your questions. And I'm sorry if I butchered the mannequin question. So we're wandering through the fashion section and we're going back into the great exhibition, Bébés at the Berry. And as you can see, we have so many Bébés throughout our regular galleries, that if you came, you'd be able to see plenty, even without this exhibit. But maybe we should go over to the final corner here of the Jumos.
Got various Jumos in different sizes here, because that's another thing that struck me about the Bebe makers is I was used to, the large format ones, but they really came in a variety of sizes, didn't they?
Yes.
Was that for economic reasons, or was it aesthetic as well? Did they like making the smaller dolls?
I think they wanted to offer a variety of sizes, and I think that once they had the mold made, then it was simply a process of shrinking the mold to get the different sizes. So I think that economics may have entered into it in the sense that you weren't making a completely different model. You were just taking the same model and shrinking it down. Again, bodies would make a difference too, because you had to have them made smaller. And also when you got into the smaller ones, you tended not to have as many joints, so they could make them more economically. And think about the wigs. One of the most expensive thing about a doll was its wig. Those wigs were luxury affairs. So the difference in the price in creating a 24-inch doll, or let's say a 10-inch doll, would have been much less to create, being the little doll, as well as the fabrics of their costumes, which were luxury silk costumes. And you were able to costume a smaller doll. If you examine the French trends or department store catalogs from that time period, and they'll show the doll, and they'll say it's a Bebe Jumeau, and they'll show the different sizes available. And you can definitely see how much less expensive the smaller ones were than the larger. And then sometimes you would even see a larger one offered with a wig, a perruque flottante, which would have been a mohair wig with long flowing hair. And the price of that was skyrocketed compared to the others, which makes you realize how expensive the mohair wigs were.
So
I had to go to the top of the mountain to get the mohair off.
I was going to say, was it a matter of supply, or was the mohair just difficult to get a hold of? But if they're
expensive.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we've had a number of other questions. It sounds like we have a lot of people who love the fashion dolls on the line right now. But before we leave this room again, I wanted to unpack a few of these incredible labels and give people an opportunity to see the photographs of how some of these objects were made. So we have some really incredible didactics that we would encourage you to come and see that talk about bebes and women's labor. I know that we've unpacked that quite a bit in this conversation, and how they were so crucial in the making of these objects. We also have a really incredible image over here of bebes at the World Fair, and a really good example of them being exhibited in a window, which I think is just a really nice moment to see. And then, of course, in advertising, which I know you guys have talked about a lot, some incredible advertising and the way that these things were promoted. So when you think about it from that angle, they really were setting the stage for things like Barbie, who eventually jumped on television. And I just love seeing these historical echoes of these kinds of themes.
Well, you mentioned to me a little while ago about a book that you had about Barbie, a children's book. Well, Emile Jumeau did all of these kind of things. He produced booklets about his dolls, storybooks about the dolls, and his marketing instinct was so absolutely phenomenal. He would have special fabrics made for his dolls. And I don't mean the luxury ones. I mean the commercial ones in the department store. There was a muslin fabric he had made, and had little flowers printed on it, either in blue or red. And it was his exclusive design for his dolls. So all of this type of thing was so important to him.
That was one thing.
Television.
No, well, although I imagine he would have been all over it if
Yes,
it had
he
existed then. But that was one thing that really struck me, was not only just the variety of media, but his recognition of the global market, or because some of these children's books were in English, because he knew that a lot of his consumers were American.
Exactly.
And as somebody who struggles with social media and any kind of self-promotion myself, you really have to admire Jamo in terms of how he recognized the quality of the product, but also how to reach different audiences and get them to buy it. And I would argue that's one of the reasons why he persists in doll collecting, because he did such a good job of cementing himself in the cultural mindset in terms of this is what a bebe is.
Exactly. I would say that to many people, bebe is synonymous with the word Jamo. In fact, he would advertise his as bebe Jamo, which was, a really kind of putting his stamp on it. Also, toward the end of the century, when he became one of the judges at these great exhibitions, judging other people's dolls, he still would, I don't know how he did this politically, but he still got something situated so that his dolls won an award, and it was the Hors Concours Award. And that meant that he was a judge, but if he hadn't been a judge, his doll would have won. And that stamp still appears on the dolls. So it's really kind of interesting that he maintained this, the sense. It was interesting. His father, had started the company, and they had started with paper mache poupées, and then moved into the bisque poupées. And his brother was designed to take over the company.
Yes,
right.
He died quite young.
He died young, suddenly, and Emile was called on to step in. And actually, he didn't even know if he wanted to do it at that point. But he did step in, and he's the one that brought the company into the foreground.
It's like he found his calling, apparently.
Well, they didn't. His father wanted nothing to do with the bebe. His father was committed to this is what we've made our company name on, has been the poupée. That's what we will stick with. And when Jamo came in, he saw the handwriting on the wall, because Jules Steiner had kind of introduced some of these, and he saw where that market was, and he said, no, we're doing it. And that's when he introduced it at the 1878 Paris exhibition and won the gold medal. And history goes on from there.
Yes, let's do that. And I believe that's where some of the questions are coming up.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
I think they caught them out of the corner of your eye and going through here.
So one of the questions was about Madame Herré, who, yes, indeed, we do have a really beautiful, exquisite example here. And one thing that I always love about this piece is to think about it again as advertising, to go back to the advertising component, that this is something that women would have been waiting, at the boats to come back from Europe and in the Baltimore Marina or in the Boston Marina, waiting to see the latest French fashions that were going to be coming off. And the reason for this, obviously, was because for a number of reasons, they're more simple to transport for the fashions. It takes less material, of course, so that's less expensive. And it's such a wonderful advertising tool to put into a window or to bring to somebody's home and say, yes, I just love this dress, but I'd really prefer it in this particular fashion. Or this particular material. So I would love to hear a little bit more from your perspective about this doll. This is one of my absolute favorites in our collection.
Well, again, the doll is very important for several reasons. It's important for fashion. It's important for the modeling of the doll, for the making of the body. The body was made of gutta percha, which is so rare. It was, number one, it was extremely expensive, because it had to be
What was the material?
gutta percha,
What is that?
Guttapercha, basically a form of rubber.
Okay.
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 All right. And she had a special body modeled for it and made of that material. And if you pick it up, you see how lightweight it is immediately. It was different than wood. So this was an important thing. Now, her family, she came from an industrial family. Her family made furniture, cast iron furniture, very gorgeous, elegant pieces with gilt and lots of scrolls and things like that. And I don't know what happened, but I guess they decided they would maybe make it in some miniature size. And we never know any of these things, but they could have made it in miniature size to take to shows, to show people what their full size furniture looked like. At any rate, then she's coming along and she kind of wants to be in the business. So she came up with a doll. And the company then had the doll size furniture, and she had developed a line of fashions that went with her clothes. And these are from, it was called the Mode Enfantine. And it's, if you look at it, it's not really lady. It's kind of a cross between lady and child. And that's really what they were, almost like a young woman, but not a very elegant fashion lady like you'd find 10 years later. And many of her clothes, if you can find them, if you look at the inside waistband, you can still see her name, Hooray, stamped on the inside waistband. The company did an entire line of accessories. And we were talking about this earlier. People do not realize what a major industry developed in Paris in the 1860s of specialists making tiny shoes, a tiny lorgnette, a little purse, a little piece of jewelry, all of these extraordinary miniature accessories that are so rare and so hard to find today. But it was something that a child, it's no different than Barbie. Look, you look in a catalog for Barbie. Oh, I want this. Oh, I want that. Well, they had them in Paris at the same time, and the child would go there and say, I want this, I want that. And the parents would get them for them. And it's just so valuable to try to preserve and find them today. She's a really beautiful example.
Yes, and we do not have her whole extensive trousseau on view right now for conservation reasons. We cycle them in periodically. So again, you'll just have to come back. And I think we can probably maybe end over here with some of the other fashions that I think we heard some requests that people were interested in seeing. We also have a really good example because you were talking about those other costumes. If you want to, yeah, one of the original brews that you were talking about before. But to maybe end on, since I guess we're kind of close to time here, do you want to comment at all on these fashions?
We have three really good examples here. I will tell you that the latest one you have would be this model, which was made by Radico and Cordonnier. And that's a great story because they were actually a young theatrical couple. And they wanted to have, they were very interested in showing costumes that would be worn in the theater. And it's a very uniquely designed doll with, you see her bisque lower legs, those, and with the painted boots and shoes. Well, that's right. It's very unique for her. And then she has this modeled bosom. It's not just a flat shoulder plate, but it's actually very realistic. That's a very desirable doll to find. The doll that is next to her is, we've talked about Leon Casimir Brew in the other room and showed his dolls. Well, this was his doll that is known as the Smiling Brew. And lots of research has been done about who was that doll modeled after? Why is she smiling? And some people have proposed that it was a portrait of the Empress Eugenie. This is interesting as to whether it would be, because the facial model was actually deposed in 1872, which was the same year that she was, using the word deposed in a different way, also deposed and fled France and went to England. On the other hand, maybe that's why the company did make a model of her as a memorial. We don't know. There's also a very famous sculpture of an angel on one of the churches in Paris, and it's exactly that face. So see lots of different possibilities of things that could have inspired him. And the doll came with various bodies. It came on the simple kid body, and it came on this body. And does that have wooden hands? I'm trying to see which one that is. Yes, okay, that one is the wooden body. And that's the body I told you a little while ago. That was the same thing as the centuries-old mannequin body, modeled exactly the same way. So it was interesting. And then we have over here a very beautiful doll by Duliak. Again, one of the people that basically assembled parts. They would have their model, a head from here, a body from there, costumes from somebody else, that type of thing. So, and very, very small production, very difficult to ever find them today.
Wonderful. Well, because we wandered this far, I know we're right at time, but I think that we probably should end by just showing people the tour de force of our fashion section, which is the Rochard. It's hard to just walk by her and not mention her. This is definitely one of our absolute favorites, primarily because she sits right at the crux of technology and fashion, and how these sort of inventions that were happening at the time were used in these really interesting ways. And perhaps maybe do you want to talk, and we'll end on this one.
Well, I have always felt this way about how she combines technology and artistry, because the presentation of the jewels on her shoulder plate is just a magnificent work of art. But inside each one of those little jewels is a miniature photograph. And this was the beginning of photography at this time. So it's extraordinary how this was combined with the presentation of a doll. Also unusual to me, and kind of like, I think I'm going to write a book called What Were They Thinking?
Yes, yes.
Because what were they thinking? Because once you put that on a body, you can't look in there anymore. It's darkened. So it's, yeah, I know. It was not plan ahead. That wasn't good thinking, but extraordinary. And here in the museum, you have the images. You show the images that are in there, and they're some of the most famous historic scenes in Paris at that time. So it is so, so valuable to have. I want to say something before you end, and I won't be able to say it, but I know that, excuse me for saying this, but I know many doll collectors walk into a room where they're going to see dolls, and they think they're going to see hundreds of dolls, and and they come in and they say, well, you don't have too many. You have done a spectacular job of showing the importance of dolls, because you're isolating them and you're putting them aside, and you're forcing a collector come in and look at it and say, okay, this is what's important about this doll, and to learn the history of them. And it's spectacular. Any collector should be here. And then they need to come back, because you're going to rotate.
Exactly. I have to comment that Sarah helped us with this reinstallation. She did an incredible job of thinking about the history. It's not chronological anymore, nor is it geographical. It's really thematic. It's topical. I guess the final thing I'll say about the Rochard is we had an opportunity to work with a foremost Stanhope expert, and we had this really wonderful little piece made here that you can look through. And I wanted to show this to you, Florence, so you could see, and you could, as we know, this is not backlit, so you couldn't nuzzle your face into the bosom and really see each one. However, we did have this made so that you can actually see for yourself what was inside. And we do have a video that plays here too that will show the public how these Stanhopes were made. And as a glassmaker, it is just so fascinating the way that the optics is working. It really is extraordinary. It's just an absolutely fabulous piece. So thank you all so much for coming here today. We're excited to be able to share this with you. It's only really a glimpse of our collection. The next exhibition that we'll be having in our new topical gallery is Madame Alexander. And so we're excited to be able to show that to you guys in the future. So tune in again. We have lots of different kinds of programming that's happening. We do have an opening of the second Friday of every month. So if you ever happen to be in Norfolk, that is an important time to stop in, and we have different thematic programs every evening. That's second Friday of the month. Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye now.